This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
It's an absolute honor and pleasure to be speaking in front of you this evening. I want to thank Ken and IHMC as a whole for providing me with such a great opportunity. So this evening, I will be discussing low carbohydrate diets for a longer, leaner, livelier lifespan, or in other words, how a low carbohydrate diet can promote optimal health and performance. I'll start by setting the stage and discussing a bit about how we used to think and contrast that to how at least most of us now think about diets and performance and longevity, with a caveat that it's very possible that some of this might be wrong or obsolete in the future. I'll then transition to talking about how low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets can both hinder or and help performance and health goals. And I'll end with discussing a few important non-dietary performance killers that could be sabotaging health and performance. All right. So in the past, we lived in this low-fat, low-calorie era that glorified carbohydrates. Carbohydrate diets were, of course, the only way an athlete could perform well. We now understand that extreme types of athletic performance may warrant different types of dietary approaches. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. We also now know that both high and low carb diets can be equally productive ways to improve body composition. Protein. So most people recognize that protein is the most important macronutrient for sparing lean muscle mass while losing weight. Here, we see that during a diet, 2 times the recommended dietary allowance for protein is optimal for sparing lean mass and optimizing fat loss. And over here, this meta-analysis shows that for optimal gains in muscle mass with resistance training, 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight is optimal. All right. Okay, all-cause mortality and protein. We also know that building and retaining muscle mass is important for longevity and health. Both the quality and the quantity of muscle mass in old age has been shown to predict survival. And here we see that all-cause mortality is higher in the lower muscle mass quartile group compared to the highest. So people with higher amounts of muscle mass have a lower chance of mortality. We also now know, well, we've always known that processed and hyperpalatable diets are usually larger culprits of weight gain and obesity-related diseases than healthy sources of either fat or carbohydrate. So this study demonstrated that basically what we already know, that ultra-processed foods increase calorie intake and also body weight. This particular study used a mixed macronutrient approach. However, there are both low and high carbohydrate versions of the hyperpalatable and processed foods that got us into trouble in the first place. So think about gluten-free pasta or these fat bombs that people have recipes for, which are both low in nutrients and very high in easy-to-eat calories. The moral of the story here is to just stick to a whole foods, unprocessed diet, regardless of your macronutrient intake. There used to be much more controversy around the Atkins-style approach and the Ornish-style approach for longevity and health, and which was better. We used to think that saturated fat caused heart disease and increased mortality. We now know that it's much more complicated than that. We also used to think that otherwise healthy food with cholesterol, like eggs or shrimp, should be avoided at all costs. And many people believe, and some still do, that animal protein will cause an increase in insulin-like growth factor and therefore promote cancer. But again, like the saturated fat story, there are many nuances to this. It's not that simple. Now we can all agree that diets high in refined carbohydrates and trans fats are detrimental to both the general population looking for health and also to athletes looking for performance. Such nutrient-devoid diets can also lead to an increase in oxidative stress and inflammation, as well as nutrient deficiencies. Most of us have come to the realization now that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to diet. So this study compared popular diets of varying macronutrient profiles and showed that all were effective at reducing weight and improving cardiovascular biomarkers. Low carbohydrate diets are now more often used as nutritional therapies. So ketogenic diets have been shown to be effective for numerous neurological conditions, not only epilepsy, which we've known for many years, but now also potentially for malignant gliomas, Alzheimer's disease, and there's even some emerging evidence of their efficacy for schizophrenia and migraines. Potential mechanisms by which ketone bodies may help with neurological disorders include regulation of energy metabolism, lowering oxidative stress and inflammation, enhancing neurotransmission, and also affecting epigenetic expression. Low-carb diets are also effective for type 2 diabetes and other metabolic conditions. So this is some data from Virta Health over here that showed that comparing the usual care for type 2 diabetes, which is a higher carbohydrate diet, compared to a low-carb diet, the low-carb diet decreased the number of patients taking medicine, it decreased their insulin dose, and also improved other biomarkers of health. Okay, so we also have some animal studies showing that ketogenic diets can extend longevity and health span. This is a study that my colleagues and I published at UC Davis, and the impetus to use a ketogenic diet was the fact that ketogenic physiology mimics calorie restriction physiology and fasting, and we know that calorie restriction is one of the interventions that increases longevity in many animal models. So over here, we see that the ketogenic diet increased median lifespan by 13% compared to the control diet, which was higher in carbohydrates. Here we see that tests of memory, coordination, strength, and endurance were better in aging ketogenic mice. And then over here, we showed that mTOR was regulated in a tissue-specific manner. So our results suggested that mTOR signaling in the liver was decreased and mTOR signaling in the muscle of ketogenic mice was increased. This pattern of tissue-specific regulation, decrease in the liver, increase in the muscle, is in theory what you would want for aging and longevity. We also saw higher levels of FOXO3A and manganese SOD in the livers of the ketogenic and low-carb mice. This suggests that these diets may function as hormetic stressors, such as exercise, eating cruciferous vegetables, or thermal stress, and upregulate antioxidant defense systems, as well as longevity pathways. And then a similar but independent study found very similar results. So they found that the ketogenic diet reduced midlife mortality and improved aging and memory in older mice. All right, and then we have the PURE study. So this was an epidemiological study that showed that across 18 countries, diets higher in fat were associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality, where diets higher in carbohydrate over here were associated with increased mortality. Okay, so can we have the best of both worlds, health and performance? In a recent book, The Passion Paradox, the authors describe some of the pitfalls of pursuing your passion. I work with a lot of people who are extremely hyper-focused on one goal, be that health or performance related, such that other, sometimes more important things in their life suffer. So striving to be the best athlete or to live the longest can definitely be conflicting goals sometimes. But I believe that we can have the best of both worlds, but perhaps not always at dietary or performance extremes. We can have balance, but maybe it's over the course of a lifetime versus for everything at once. So we'll now talk about some of the ways that health and performance goals can either conflict or complement each other on a low carbohydrate diet. The anti-inflammatory properties of ketone bodies are speculated to be behind many of their therapeutic effects, especially for neurological conditions. The anti-inflammatory effects of ketones were first discovered when beta-hydroxybutyrate was shown to inhibit the activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome. Ketone bodies may also reduce oxidative stress compared to glycolysis, which is the process of using carbohydrate for energy. The anti-inflammatory effects of ketone bodies may also offset inflammation from other lifestyle choices and even exercise, which can promote athletic longevity. While people of every age can benefit from less chronic inflammation, the anti-inflammatory effects of ketones may benefit an aging population the most, considering the way ketones can affect metabolism and physical health. And ketones may combat something that we called inflammaging. So inflammaging is the combination of the words inflammation and aging. And it refers to the chronic low-grade inflammation that occurs with age and contributes to age-related pathologies. There are many different inputs that contribute to and perpetuate inflammaging, and you can see them here. These include cell senescence, cell debris, gut dysbiosis, immunosenescence, and procoagulation factors. So while we have no direct data supporting this hypothesis, it's very possible that the anti-inflammatory effects of ketone bodies may mitigate some of the damage that we see with inflammaging or even slow aging itself. Okay, so using fat as a primary fuel source rather than relying on carbohydrate may help lower gastrointestinal stress during exercise, due to the idea that fat adaptation allows an athlete to use less fuel during exercise and racing, and allows them to pull from body fat stores. Exercise, especially that which is intense, long, and in the heat, can cause something called intestinal hyperpermeability. We'll talk about this a little bit later. And any food that is eaten in this state, especially processed carbohydrates, while blood is diverted away from the gut and toward the working muscles, can lead to potential gut injury. This flow chart right here describes a little bit how that might happen. If using fat as a fuel allows athletes to consume less exogenous calories, this can be a way to reduce exercise nutrition-induced gastrointestinal symptoms. And then aside from relying on fat as a fuel source during exercise, it can also help with blood glucose stability, both after eating and between meals. So right here, we see that high glycemic variability throughout the day is associated with worse metabolic clinical outcomes. And worse outcomes in type 2 diabetes in general. Another reason that an athlete might want to rely more on fat oxidation during exercise is the fact that the human body stores of carbohydrate are finite, while fat stores are relatively unlimited. Carbohydrate in many cases is a limiting factor, and if carbohydrate can be spared and more fat used at higher intensities without performance dropping off, that will allow an athlete, in theory, to go harder for longer. As one might expect, we see higher rates of fat oxidation in fat-adapted athletes. And what is perhaps a little bit more counterintuitive is that we see similar glycogen contents in the muscles of low and high-carb athletes, suggesting that low-carb nutrition strategy does not detrimentally affect muscle glycogen stores. This is a good thing. We also see that in Ironman athletes, performance is positively correlated with maximal fat oxidation. And as you see here, there's always more questions than answers. So especially in the case of increasing maximal fat oxidation, we have a lot of things that are still unknown. Hopefully in the future we'll have studies to elucidate some of these things. Okay, so body composition. As far as the literature is concerned, good studies of the effects of ketogenic diets on body composition are sparse, and there are many confounding variables, which include whether or not there was a control group, whether or not the groups were matched for protein, and whether or not the subjects in the group were doing resistance exercise. While a ketogenic or low carbohydrate diet isn't necessarily superior to other diets for fat loss, it's likely not harmful if protein is adequate. Many people find that adherence is also better due to the potential appetite-suppressing effects of ketone bodies. Weight class athletes may be a group that benefits from periods of lower carbohydrate diets. This was a randomized crossover study that showed that compared to a higher carbohydrate diet, a ketogenic diet improved body composition and facilitated weight loss in Olympic weightlifting athletes and power athletes. And then finally, this study looked at a ketogenic diet versus a non-ketogenic diet on body composition in resistance-trained athletes. And it showed that while a ketogenic diet was beneficial for decreasing body fat and therefore improving body composition, it wasn't necessarily as good as a non-ketogenic diet for optimal muscle gain. All right, so whether a low carbohydrate diet affects performance will depend on the type of performance we're talking about, the individual, and then the level of performance that they're wishing to seek. For cognitive performance, we have a lot of anecdotes suggesting that ketogenic diets enhance cognitive function. Studies show that in disease states and also animal models of neurological pathologies, a ketogenic diet may be helpful. However, this is a theory. And it's possible that those who experience enhanced cognition on a ketogenic diet have a level of insulin resistance at the brain. If the brain can't utilize glucose efficiently, then when ketones are present, the lights turn on, so to speak. In healthy people, there seems to be no increase in cognitive function on a ketogenic diet. However, studies of disease states that may be at least partially due to hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia show positive effects of ketosis on cognition. So this study right here showed that ketosis improved memory and mild cognitive impairment. This study demonstrated cognitive improvements with higher serum beta-hydroxybutyrate levels, which were induced with MCT oil. This study down here showed that supplemental MCTs increased serum beta-hydroxybutyrate and reversed the impairment in cognitive function due to hypoglycemia in type 1 diabetes. And finally, this was a recent randomized clinical trial that was conducted in patients with mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's disease that showed an improvement in memory scores with the modified Atkins diet, which is a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet. Okay, endurance performance. Endurance athletes are likely the ones to reap the most benefit from a ketogenic or low-carb diet. The longer the event, the more likely the pronounced the benefit will be. The scientific evidence for keto-adapted endurance athletes is kind of a mixed bag, likely due to difference in study methodology. I'll summarize with this. For longer events, ketogenic diets may maintain performance. For shorter, faster events, it's possible that they would impair performance. There's little evidence that ketones alone improve endurance performance. However, supplemental exogenous ketones, along with carbohydrates, may provide some benefit. Sorry, I keep going backward. So we see that when exogenous ketone esters are combined with carbohydrate supplementation, time trial performance is enhanced compared to carbohydrate supplementation alone. And then here we see that post-exercise glycogen replenishment is enhanced when a ketone ester drink is combined with carbohydrate post-exercise. All right, so power, speed, and strength performance. On a biochemical level, it does make sense that low carbohydrate diets could impair power, speed, and strength performance. However, like endurance, the literature is a little bit of a mixed bag, and there is variability in responses. Intensity and volume could dictate how an athlete performs on a low carbohydrate diet. So powerlifting performance may not be impaired, whereas elite level sprinting could be impaired. From studies we have in gymnasts and martial artists, ketogenic diets don't seem to negatively affect performance. It's definitely possible to increase strength on a ketogenic diet. However, protein probably becomes more important in the absence of carbohydrates. Okay, so now I'll dive into how performance and longevity goals can potentially conflict on a low-carb or ketogenic diet. Extremism. Extremism is the first way that a low-carbohydrate diet can get somebody into trouble. One could argue that extreme pursuits of athleticism can be unhealthy and require one to take their body to a level that may not be conducive to health or longevity. So we're talking maybe something on one end of the spectrum like bodybuilding, on the other end of the spectrum like ultramarathon running. But sometimes compromises are made in the face of someone's passion. Similarly, some people go to such lengths to promote longevity that they either miss out on living life they have in the moment, or they even partake in longevity-promoting interventions that are actually counterproductive, such as chronically and excessively restricting protein or calories. Okay. It's not uncommon for people in this day and age to fear fat because they grow up in an era of low fat. They fear carbohydrates because now insulin drives fat gain. They fear calories in general because they have a body composition goal. And then they fear protein because it stimulates mTOR and that causes cancer. And they fear vegetables because they have oxalates and lectins. So what's left? You get ice cubes. There is also an epidemic of low energy availability in sport. So this state is termed relative energy deficiency in sport. One of the great aspects of low carbohydrate diets is that they tend to be appetite suppressing, which is great for weight loss, but perhaps not great for maintaining positive energy balance that athletes need. So while carbs may not be necessary all the time, calories to fuel the body and sport are necessary. Unfortunately, some of the consequences seen here, performance consequences and health consequences of low energy availability in sports are simply not conducive to either athletic performance or overall health. So these include things like low sex hormones, poor bone mineral density, risk of osteoporosis, and also risk of injury. Okay, this big word, endotoxemia. So in certain contexts, components of even a healthy low-carbohydrate diet can cause something called postprandial endotoxemia and inflammation. This occurs when lipid polysaccharide, or LPS, is released from gram-negative bacteria and crosses the GI tract into the bloodstream and causes inflammation. LPS is found in small amounts in healthy individuals. However, large amounts induce inflammation and are associated with many chronic conditions, including obesity, cardiovascular disease, cognitive impairment, type 2 diabetes. Contributors to endotoxemia include dietary fat, especially processed saturated fats, processed carbohydrates, alcohol, dysbiosis, which is the imbalance of good and bad bacteria in the gut, and also exercise. This is one case where a high-fat diet may be counterproductive. So sometimes in the short term, strategic use of a lower fat diet or even a modified fat diet that decreases saturated fat and increases more Mediterranean style fats like fatty fish and nuts and seeds and olive oil can be helpful. Plant polyphenols, so the colorful compounds in plants, are also helpful for endotoxemia. I would also consider testing and treating the gut if something like this is occurring, and using strategic and specific short-term supplementation, such as probiotics, prebiotics, glutamine, herbal antimicrobials if indicated. Okay, so the gut microbiota. We know much less about the gut microbiota and what constitutes a healthy gut flora than we think we do. However, the one consistency seems to be that it's very subject to change with diet. Studies do show that macronutrients likely shift the gut microbiota. However, since there are many ways to create a ketogenic diet, we can't look at all these studies and say that low-carb diets affect the microbiota in this one general way. So for example, you can have a ketogenic diet made of Crisco and bacon, or you can have a ketogenic diet made of meat, offal, fatty fish, avocados, nuts and seeds, and non-starchy, colorful vegetables. The two diets most certainly have different effects on the gut microbiota. Butyrate is a product of bacterial fermentation and a primary energy source for colonocytes. It has some extracellular signaling properties as well. On a low-carb diet that is also low in fiber, it's likely that butyrate production would be limited, but some speculate that beta-hydroxybutyrate can also function as a source of butyrate. There's also some speculation that some of the anti-seizure benefits of ketogenic diets are related to changes in the gut microbiota. So a recent mouse study showed that the ketogenic diet increased two forms of bacteria, transplantation of the ketogenic microbiota, as well as inoculation with these species, provided seizure protection to mice that were fed a regular control, higher carb diet. The researchers hypothesized that the mechanism by which this occurred was an increase in the GABA to glutamate ratio in the hippocampus. In general, most people say that the greater gut bacteria diversity, the better it is for health, but this is a good example where more bacterial diversity might not be better. The ketogenic diet decreased total alpha diversity in the gut, but by increasing certain species, it did have a positive effect on seizure control. And human epilepsy studies also report a decrease in bacterial diversity on the ketogenic diet. Some of this, it's possible, may be mitigated by eating some colorful non-starchy vegetables that feed good bacteria. Okay, metabolic inflexibility. A diet, any kind of dietary macronutrient extremes of very high carb, very high fat, that are pursued chronically may cause metabolic flexibility, which is the inability to burn both fat and carbohydrate well. Short-term studies in athletes suggest that pyruvate dehydrogenase, PDH, activity is lower and PDK is higher, we see here and here, in fat-adapted athletes. So why would an athlete care about this? PDH is necessary for carbohydrate energy metabolism, and a downregulation of PDH activity would subsequently impair carbohydrate usage. One could argue that for events that require athletes to tap into glycolytic energy systems, such as sprinting, a downregulation of PDH activity could potentially be detrimental to performance. But there is a potential way around this. We see that high-intensity interval training or sprint training actually increases PDH activity. So in theory, a low-carbohydrate athlete could train at higher intensities to cancel out the decrease in PDH activity. Long-term carbohydrate diet can also induce something that we call physiological insulin resistance. This is different from pathological insulin resistance, and it's where the muscles become insulin resistant because they're sparing glucose for the brain and other tissues that require glucose and can't run on ketones, such as the red blood cells. The muscles then that become insulin resistant, when somebody who has been eating low carb for a long time decides to eat a meal that is higher in carbohydrates, their blood glucose spikes higher than it would if they were eating carbohydrates consistently. So these were a couple of studies in healthy subjects that demonstrated some of the potential reasons that one might not want to have a gigantic carbohydrate refeed on a low-carb diet. So these guys were given 75 grams of carbs that was consumed after a week of a low-carbohydrate diet. And postprandial insulin and glucose and also markers of endothelial inflammation were increased. This suggests that when a large bolus of carbohydrates are consumed on a low-carb diet, the vascular repercussions of hyperglycemia might be heightened. So science tells us over and over again that carbohydrates are ergogenic, performance enhancing. So the question is, how can an athlete get the benefits of both eating low-carb but also using carbs as performance enhancing aids? Or what can a person do to mitigate the effects of eating a higher carbohydrate meal amongst an otherwise low carbohydrate diet? So first of all, what is low carb? The definition of low carb might differ for different people depending on the population being discussed. So for example, in this study that looked at the metabolic characteristics of fat-adapted athletes, showed that some of them were eating upwards of 150 grams of carbohydrates a day. You wouldn't think that that would put somebody in ketosis, but for an athlete, it definitely could. In contrast, a more sedentary individual might need to limit carbohydrates to 30 or 50 grams a day to achieve the same metabolic state. Strategic timing of carbohydrates can be used to aid both performance and health goals. Strategic or strategies such as sleeping with low glycogen availability and then followed by training with low glycogen ability. So this would look like evening glycogen depleted exercise followed by a low carbohydrate dinner, followed by sleep, followed by fasted exercise in the morning, could be beneficial for adaptations to exercise. Interestingly enough, these adaptations at the cellular level are similar to what we might want for longevity, such as an increase in AMP kinase, P53, and SIR2 inactivity. We also have some studies to suggest that a targeted carbohydrate approach may be beneficial at the performance level as well. Carbohydrate timing can also play an important role for a non-athletic population. Timing a high carbohydrate meal after exercise, especially whole body resistance exercise, will take advantage of postprandial or post-exercise non-insulin mediated glucose uptake in muscles and an increase in GLUT4 activity. Also, something like taking a shorter walk after eating a carbohydrate-rich meal can help with glucose regulation. All right, protein. There are very few specific circumstances that actually warrant restriction of dietary protein. While many people are concerned that eating too high protein will kick them out of ketosis, there's little evidence to support this concern. Studies have shown that high levels of protein, even up to 1.5 to 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, can be consumed, with serum beta-hydroxybutyrate registering 0.5 millimolars per liter or higher, which is technically ketosis. Protein is also necessary for building and retaining muscle mass and quality, both of which are critically important for performance and longevity. Adequate protein consumption gets even more crucial as we age and become anabolically resistant, and thus we need stronger signals for muscle maintenance and growth, such as protein and resistance exercise. And ideally, protein timing is spread out throughout the day, relatively evenly. So like we just see down here, 30-gram doses, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, versus backloading all of your protein. In theory, periods of fasting, short-term fasting or protein restricting, and periods of famine, so higher protein consumption, could be beneficial to health by regulating mTOR in that muscle-specific fashion that we saw with the mice. So this would look like combining strength training and protein with periodic fasting or time-restricted eating to get the best of both worlds. All right, can you, but should you? So there are a lot of things in life that we can do, but the question is, should we? For example, some people can get away with eating hundreds of grams of carbohydrates a day, but should they? Some people can get away with eating no dietary carbohydrates and copious amounts of fats to get themselves into ketosis, but should they? We know that there are multiple ways to get into ketosis, and I'm not advocating for one, but this is just to show that there are many. So that could be carbohydrate restriction, addition of fat, calorie restriction, fasting, low-intensity exercise, or even exogenous ketones. And finally, you can eat a ketogenic diet, but should you? So ask yourself, who are you and what your goals are. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time discussing how diet, particularly low carbohydrate diets, can positively affect health and performance or negatively affect health and performance. While each of these additional factors are important and deserve their own deserve to be their own topics, I would be remiss to not at least mention some of them. These are other things besides diet that can sabotage health and performance if neglected. So sleep. We can argue that sleep is probably the greatest legal performance enhancer that we have. It plays a critical role in many areas of health and performance, including but not limited to athletic performance, insulin sensitivity, glucose tolerance, obesity, hunger and satiety hormones, the gut microbiota, our mood, immune function, cognitive and motor performance, hormonal production and balance, and disease risk. Stress. So stress encompasses a lot more than we might think. This could be excessive exercise, dietary restraint, job and relationship stress, environmental stress, social isolation. Robert Sapolsky, who is a world-renowned Stanford researcher, often talks about the unique relationships that humans have with stress. So humans have the ability to perceive potential threats that aren't real, while other animals kick into sympathetic response only when there was a true threat to their survival. We, on the other hand, are unique in that our brains can create an imaginary stress response when in actuality there is no true threat. Our perception and interpretation of stressors is also key. Obviously, a healthy amount of stress is necessary and inevitable. However, chronic sympathetic output over time from perceiving too many things as stressors in daily life can be detrimental to overall health. So the question is, what do we do? There's a lot of things: laughing, spending time in nature, getting a dog, taking a break from technology, prioritizing sleep, exercising appropriately, becoming part of a greater purpose. All of these things are potentially tools in the toolbox worth having, although some of them are easier said than done. Okay, social connection. And social isolation and loneliness are important aspects of health that often get overlooked. Just like any other stressor, loneliness can have direct physiological and psychological effects that will adversely affect health. So a couple things to consider. Using Facebook to avoid social isolation reduces perceived social support. Stronger and more diverse social networks are associated with resistance to the common cold. Social isolation can decrease BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Loneliness can disrupt the binaural sleep, or the binaural cortisol rhythm. Social connectivity is associated with lower rates of depression. Social isolation adversely influences expression of key genes involved in stress and inflammatory responses. Okay, purpose. So having what you feel is purpose in life is surprisingly important. It's been shown to be associated with better sleep quality and also physiological function with age. This particular study right here showed an inverse association between purpose and weak grip strength and slow walking speed in older adults. So a higher purpose means higher grip strength, higher walking speed. And movement. So some kind of low-level movement practice outside traditional exercise is important for avoiding chronic disease. Interruptions of sedentary time are beneficial for glucose regulation and insulin sensitivity and actually change things at an epigenetic level. It's been estimated that reducing excessive sitting to less than 3 hours a day could result in a life expectancy increase of 2 years. And amongst active college students, cell phone use predicts the risk of having something we call active couch potato syndrome. So this is somebody who exercises enough, but is also highly sedentary outside of that. The modern world filled with desk jobs and Netflix makes this really hard and does not set us up for success. So getting in enough movement often requires reevaluating our environment and being intentional. Okay, so to end, I'll summarize with who may benefit and who may want to exercise caution when considering a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet. So you may benefit from a low-carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet if you have metabolic health concerns, such as insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes. You have a neurological condition. You have weight loss and or body composition goals. You enjoy eating lower carb, higher fat foods. You are an endurance athlete looking for fat adaptation. You are an older individual looking to ward off diseases of chronic aging or chronic diseases of aging, or you want to be able to go longer periods of time without getting hangry, or you wish to marry general day-to-day life and recreational performance with longevity. So lots of people could benefit. You may exercise caution around implementing low-carb or ketogenic diet if you want to perform at an elite level in a high-intensity athletic pursuit. You want to maximize muscle growth. You are an athlete who tends to undereat. You are healthy and just like to eat whole foods, unprocessed carbohydrates, or you can't tolerate large amount of fats due to some kind of gut pathology. Okay, that is everything. Question time? Okay. Right here in front.
Thank you. Recently, the Harvard Alumni Journal, not the medical journal, but the Alumni Journal, had a remarkable article on chronic inflammation, and as far as chronic illness was concerned. And the upshot of the article was that it wasn't the chronic inflammation causing the problem, it was the immune system attacking the inflammation and causing the cell debris which caused the problem. And their solution was, remarkably, cod liver oil.
Oh, wow.
Do you have any more ideas about how mature people can get rid of cell debris and optimize living?
So cod liver oil, that's very interesting. Fasting can be very beneficial for the immune system and inflammation as well. That doesn't have to be like long day, multi-day water fast. That could be something like time-restricted eating, which could be compressing your eating window. So you're eating, say, 8 hours a day, and then you're fasting for 16 hours a day. So fasting is one of those that can really help with immune system regulation. Yeah. Right here.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the study that from Lancet Journal that came out a little more than a year ago and was very much in the mainstream media, which compared high-fat, low-carb diets with other diets, and this is a refereed journal, Lancet, and a study of about 20,000 people over a long period of time. And that, in essence, the summary was that life expectancy for the ketogenic diet decreased life expectancy by 4 years overall. Really? Yes. I was on the ketogenic diet and at the time and rethought that based on that study. Are you familiar with that study?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay.
But we also, I don't know how
it was in humans, not in mice.
Yeah, and we don't, the problem is we don't have any longevity studies in humans, so maybe they were extrapolating from data. I don't know. I'll have to look into that.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. So you made my wife very happy because we can put butter on the steak and eat shrimp and grits. But I'm just curious about the protein source. I've read some stuff recently about the coming insect-based proteins. Do you have any research done on that at all? Is all protein? Would that grasshopper protein be the same as beefsteak protein? Lastly, I hope you'll come back for our marathon in the spring.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the invite. So all protein is not protein when it comes to plants and animals. We have plant protein, which you have to combine. So you have to combine like a bean and a grain to get a complete protein with a complete amino acid profile. Whereas for animal protein, that's typically all of that is complete protein. So it's all even as far as protein is concerned. The insect protein, like cricket or grasshopper, I don't know of many studies that have looked at that. However, it would be a complete protein source. So I don't know necessarily economically how, 25 grams worth of cricket powder or cricket protein equates to 25 grams of protein from beef. But they would be nutritionally very similar. Yeah. Over there.
All right, first of all, I wanted to say to Mark, you weren't paying attention because if you noticed, all you got to do is not sit more than 3 hours a day, and you gain 2 years. Okay, I've been on a ketogenic diet for about 3 years, and I do a lot of the things you talked about. I have experienced being able to, perform at a low level of exercise for a much longer period of time without getting tired, and maybe go out for a 3-hour bike ride and not even eat, and being able to just go through that because I am burning the fat. I recently had an experience, however, where I went out to Mount Rainier, and I'm doing a fairly difficult route, steep, above 8,000 feet, but it was a heavy pack also. And on the first day, I'm still on the ketogenic diet, no carbs or low carbs, and I completely ran out of energy and struggled. That night, I did supplement with carbohydrates, and I did fine on the rest of the climb. But what I wanted to ask was, I've read since that for high-intensity, long-duration, or extreme, high intensity and long durations, that your body can't process the fat fast enough to provide the energy source. So I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that is true. Fat is good for more of the sustained, low-intensity exercise, whereas for higher intensity for a longer period of time, the issue isn't the long time, the issue is the higher intensity. You need to rely more on carbohydrates because those are more fast-acting fuel. So some people say, okay, using fat as fuel is like putting kindling on a fire. Is like putting a log on a fire, whereas using carbohydrate as fuel is like putting kindling on a fire. So it's burnt quick and burnt just right then and there for higher intensity purposes. I'm sorry, what's that?
What's the effect of supplementing the way I described?
So you might see, like I talked about, a decrease in enzymes if you're on a long-term ketogenic diet that help with carbohydrate metabolism. So you may not get as much benefit as you would from those carbohydrates as if you were, consuming a high carbohydrate diet in general. But you will still get some benefit there. For using them. And the other thing is, if you were at altitude, there is some data to suggest that your body, regardless of whether you're a fat burner or a carb burner, will automatically switch to more carbohydrate burning at altitude. Yeah. In the back?
Do you make any distinction between total carbohydrates and net carbohydrates? Because I know Atkins, for example, you'd subtract the sugar alcohols and the fiber from the total carbs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One of the reasons I think that's important is because if you're counting total carbohydrates, your vegetable consumption, even non-starchy vegetables, will be very low. Whereas if you're subtracting the fiber, which is basically indigestible carbohydrates for us, our gut bugs digest the fiber, then you can allow a lot more non-starchy vegetables in a ketogenic diet.
So you're talking about net carbohydrates when you say low carbohydrates?
Yes, yeah, net carbs. Yeah. Right here.
You refer to low-carb or ketogenic diets, and I wonder if you're implying that a low-carb has to be ketogenic to reap the benefits, or if you get benefits with low-carb, less severe, not able to induce ketosis. And if ketosis is important, what test reliably measures that? Is it enough to just check urinary ketones?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the distinction between low carb and ketogenic diets are always low carb diets aren't always ketogenic. Most of the studies show that you can get some of the benefits with low carb, but a lot of the ketone specific benefits, the anti-inflammation, are coming from those ketone bodies. So you may not get all of the benefits with low carb that you would with keto in general. There have been some at least animal studies to show that a cyclic ketogenic diet, so some periods of ketosis sometimes, can be just as beneficial from at least a longevity standpoint. And then as far as measuring, I would say measuring is best in the blood. So stick your finger, the little tabs that measure your ketones are kind of expensive right now. Hopefully in the future they'll be less expensive, like the little glucose meters. But yeah, breath and urine are not as good as blood ketone meters.
Time for one more question.
Okay. Here.
The presentation touched briefly on the relationship between low carbohydrates or ketogenic diets and bone density. Could you expand on that a little bit, please?
So not directly. That was in the context of underfueling an athlete. So if a low carbohydrate diet, one of the good effects sometimes and bad effects other times is the fact that it will suppress appetite. And so if an athlete is eating a low carb diet, which suppresses their appetite, sometimes they'll be in a state of what we call low energy availability. And that state of not having enough energy around to fuel their sport and also their body functions, their physiological functions, can reduce bone density through changes in sex hormones and whatnot. So I don't know of any direct evidence of ketogenic diets on bone density, but if you're under eating, then that can be one avenue that it affects that.
On that note, let's thank our speaker.